O tēnā koutou katoa, ko Michael Baker, tōko ingoa. It's wonderful to be here today, 11 years of SHIVERS and some really amazing, remarkable events like the pandemic that have demonstrated so much. So why it's so important to get respiratory infectious disease surveillance working well. And arguably, it is the most important surveillance activity now for any country. And I think the system that New Zealand's got, it's a national treasure, it's a taonga, and I think now is really a time to celebrate how far we've come, but also how much still needs to be done. And I think the speakers today have really provided a wonderful starting point for that discussion. And I think they really illustrated firstly, why the science information is so vitally important, but also why it's a vital structure for pandemic management. And if anyone had any doubt, we only had to look at those first few months of the pandemic, and the whole country was sitting there focused on an epidemic curve, I think for the first time. And actually, at a certain point, focused on a single case of an infectious disease. When has that ever happened to that extent, where New Zealand actually changed its alert levels based on a single case very swiftly? So I think there's no doubt that this is the most important surveillance activity for a modern society. So we really do have to get this right. And I think we've heard about some really great presentations on the end user perspective. I mean, people like Marc-Alain, Widdowson talking about just the real importance of this research knowledge at a global level. And Nicholas Jones, I think, providing a great overview of why this information is so important for driving the public health response. To Pōrā giving a wonderful presentation about why this information is vital for supporting the Te Tiriti partnership. We've also heard the provider perspective, I think, from Sue Huang, Sarah Jefferies, and also Nikki Turner, who obviously crosses many different bases. And I think she did summarise at the end just the complexity of making all of this work, I think, very well. I mean, we've got more resources coming in. We've got the traditional investment from the health system, Ministry of Health, and so on. We've also got further investment from international donors, and philanthropists, which is wonderful. New Zealand's really been a huge beneficiary of that global investment. And now, of course, TANIFA, the Public Health or the Infectious Disease Research Platform, as another source of investment in this area. But the health environment has got more complex. We've got more end users. We've got not just the Ministry of Health now, but the Public Health Agency, Te Whātua and the National Public Health Service, and Te Aka Whaiora, the Māori Health Authority. So it's not simpler to do this work, and that's why I think today's meeting is really timely to try and integrate all of these perspectives. And so what we're going to do now is ask all of our speakers from the early session to come forward and sit at the table here, and if that's, I think you know who you are. And I would say, having worked at ESR and a number of other environments, that in the end, ESR is our national treasure. It is the agency that can hopefully integrate all of these strands, the end user perspective, the provider perspective, and make it all work. Because in many ways that is possibly their number one national responsibility now. But anyway, there may be others in the room with a different perspective. So the first question, we actually have sent these around before to our panellists, so that hopefully won't be too surprised. The first question we're going to put to them is, what would an optimal respiratory infectious disease surveillance system look like for Aotearoa? And I might start with the end user perspective, and I think Nicholas Jones is probably carrying that small burden for our national agencies.
I think I covered off most of my answer really to this question around the optimal respiratory surveillance system in my talk earlier, the key points around meeting those requirements. But just to go over the key things again, I think it's about guiding the outbreak control, guiding policy, ensuring we have equity in terms of outcomes, And I think the part I raised towards the end of my talk was really about making sure that our response is actually following best practice, so that we are actually delivering in terms of the response. But I'll leave it there and pass on to Pōrā maybe.
Tag. I'll probably end up just saying the same thing in a different way.
Actually, it's working now.
It's working.
Yeah.
I think it was a bit planned. It's working now. I was just saying, I will say the same thing again and again and again in different ways, because it's important for us to hear what we need to hear. The optimal surveillance system is one where your community and your partners are on board, where they're trained to lead some of the surveillance, to support some of the surveillance, to understand what surveillance is, because the information you get out of that goes back somewhere else. Then they wait for you to say, here's what's going on with you. But if you know that a lot sooner, it's about building capacity in our communities and with our partners. So anything that leads to that is gold standard.
Nikki, as a... Oh no, Sarah, go.
Yeah.
Sarah, go.
I mean, a lot has been spoken already. It's really important that we have layers to our surveillance system, so that if something falls over, we have something else that we can lean on. And multi-source surveillance is a big topic of WHO at the moment after the pandemic, but also that we have a resource system that is able to adjust what those priorities of surveillance are, to be responsive to community needs, as Pōrā is speaking to. There's a treaty dynamic in how we govern our surveillance systems, that it's there is a partnership and ability to be Maori control, and that we are sharing information and control with communities so that they get the information that they need in the right time, as well as ensuring that decision makers are appropriately informed in a timely way. So, kia ora. So yeah, that was just a few comments from me. Thank you.
Kia ora, and I was really answering the question, in the presentation, but I guess I just wanted to go over my sense that firstly, we need to be sure we're asking the right questions in the right format in the right way. So often we ask the wrong question in the wrong way. We've got great databases, we often use them maybe not quite usefully in the way we want to. And then we're just on the beginning path, I believe, of effectively synthesising all our multiple databases. And we have traditionally started from our traditional surveillance. It is very much time for us to start from community narratives and think, who are the communities, who are the multiple communities, not who's the loudest voices. We've ourselves tended to be the loudest voices for years. It's time for us to start listening to others, says me feeling quite old today. So the multiple sources, the multiple voices, and then using a much more synthesising approach, such as the model I suggested from Professor Dow, that to look at synthesising and using complexity science in our surveillance approach. I think New Zealand's in a fantastic position to be really cool stuff. And then repeatability over time, so that when we answer the questions and we hear the results, we can go back and review and refine, and use more like a CQI cycle to answer, review, refine, so that then we do know what our populations are thinking and why they're shifting, and why one day we say one thing and the next day we feel something different, because we're not listening and hearing and synthesising enough.
I just want to echo Nikki, Sarah, and Nick Jones mentioned about the surveillance, and I just want to emphasize that, the traditional core component of surveillance is vitally important for us, and it is where we draw the historical data from. It is where we have some sense of the future pandemic or future strange seasonal flu, what they would be look like, and to anticipate and to be able to predict. And so I also appreciate that we have new tools in our toolbox, and but those all need to be built on what we already know, and to be able to still maintaining our baseline, and to be able to elaborate further in different perspectives. And from that perspective, I feel we need to maintaining our core function. That is the minimum we need to maintain, and then build upon that. Mentions as Nikki touched in the primary care area, there's lots of new tools we can use, and we know COVID is very disruptive and interruptive of IOI surveillance. So in which way we can utilize the new tool, but still maintaining connected with our old baseline. So then we have such a continuity, and also make sense of our flu activities or potential future COVID activities to be able to connect it for many, many years and forward and backwards.
Just want to add, just wanted to echo what you were saying to Pōrā about the importance of community, and I think that also brings to the fore the need for the local perspective and the knowledge to be available to communities. But also I wanted to point out that we can't conduct respiratory ID surveillance in New Zealand on our own, and actually international and global collaboration is critical as well. So looking at it from both of those perspectives. I did want to touch on the human knowledge and attitudes aspect of it, because I know, Michael, you've mentioned that. And throughout the COVID pandemic, we have conducted regular behavioural knowledge and insights, and it's been critical.
It's good.
So,
It's very useful.
Thanks. So, is there anyone from the audience who has a burning question at the moment? And we'll work through some other questions about the other ones we've got are the biggest gaps. How can we get from where we are now to this optimal system, and what can we collectively do to progress changes in this area? So what are the next action steps? So we're going to work through these, but does anyone from the audience have something urgent thought at this point? So there will be hopefully time at the end. So I guess the next question is, what's our biggest gap?
I think one of the biggest gaps has been over time the way in which we don't always get typing of influenza. Sometimes it's to do, I think, with the complexity of perhaps the funding arrangements and laboratory arrangements, but we haven't always deliberately identified the public health need. A lot of our surveillance is based on data generated for clinical purposes, and sometimes we need to articulate that there is an additional test that needs to be done, for example, to provide that public health information. That would be one of the gaps that strikes me.
May
Yeah.
respond on that? I think in terms of flu surveillance, we are able to apply real-time PCR for typing, subtyping, and our data can be quite fast. On a weekly basis, we published on ESR website about that. Yes, I agree. In terms of laboratory, lots of sample is derived from the routine clinical diagnosis. When it's meet the clinical management requirement, there's no further subtyping and the typing result to come. It's often just, if it's a flu A, that's a flu B, that's enough. But actually drill down to what is the H1 or what is H3 is something, because it's not close to the bed, and it's more in a public health surveillance area. So we do not often receive the samples in a timely way, and that is a bit lag from that perspective. Yeah, and Lauren today will probably give a bit more presentation about whole genome sequencing. Potentially, one of the areas in the future is move more into directly from clinical sample to sequence all the way. So you would know, have a bedside use, but at the same time give you the typing, subtyping result in a timely way. That's the future.
Pōrā, be interested in your perspective. What do you think is the biggest gap, or perhaps it's a list of gaps?
There's a couple of gaps. Some more obvious than others. But when was the last time you saw a lab at a marae or at the local hall? Or what's the opportunity to, we're a lot cleverer than we were a few years ago and even probably last week. What are the opportunities to place pop-up labs, surveillance systems in your communities? So, you've got to have a look at when I say community, I mean everybody outside, right? The infrastructure. One, for its potential to partner in there. That's one example in there. Well, let's just stay with that one for now. Because that gives the speed of information back to the community together, right? To do that together so we can get onto things a lot faster. It's the I liken it the same as we used to have dental clinics, dental clinics in schools. I grew up with a school that had one. We had a nurse come and visit us who would watch out for us, look out for us. Same thing, the same thing. You have multiple kura kaupapa, and I'm just talking on some Māori schools, but schools overall. The speed of information to protect the tamariki, to protect whole whānau, the gap is reimagining and moving forward on how to make that happen.
Sarah?
Well, to add to that, I guess, how do we become more proactive and less reactive in how we establish our surveillance? And the big part of that, and in addition to appropriate and good governance, is all the system enablers around sustainable resourcing to ensure that we have appropriate overarching strategies for why we're doing surveillance, that it's prioritised appropriately and those priorities are reviewed regularly, that we are making sure that we build evaluations into our system so we understand how we're delivering on those priorities, and that we have clear roles and responsibilities about who's doing what, why, that it's coordinated, and that it isn't a unidirectional process, that multiple players have a participating, meaningful voice in the decisions around how our surveillance systems are working.
Nikki, you had your presentation covered.
Yeah, I just going to say, I'm going to just take a primary care angle on it because it actually covers the whole problem for the community as well as about participation. So we had surveillance mechanisms traditionally that primary care were doing more out of just a willingness rather than a part of their daily lives. And when their daily lives got hard, as it did in primary care, it fell over. So I think to look at all our surveillance platforms, either they're seamlessly integrated into what we do now, or if we're getting participation, it needs to be meaningful for the participants. So I, as a GP, had to do a RAT test first. How did I also do that with a PCR swab as one example? Our community narrative data collections, when it has meaning for them, they want to participate and be part of it and help design the questions and the narrative. So participation of those who collect, so they're actually part of the surveillance network. And then, once people feel engaged and participatory, you get repeatability. And then back to the point that we don't synthesise enough, that we're all just in our little silos a bit. I think we're doing well, got a long way to go.
I just want to respond to Pōrā's point. I think it's really, really valid about the laboratory or the diagnostic area to be able to understand the community needs. And I think the COVID-19 really shows that the widespread of RAT test is really excellent ways, even though RAT test has a bit lower sensitivity, specificity, but the speed to be able to generate information is really, really great. From our perspective of running the cohort study, we found that this is really, really helpful for us to get that information to be able to launch into the household transmission study that saves us quite a few days of time. And I think, yeah, we would love to get a better point of the care type of testing, and in the family, in the household, to be able to run it. But that also created a challenge for us, and we have to think about our surveillance system. For example, the community-based surveillance at the moment is this GPII surveillance, and we all know we had a challenge at the moment with interrupted patient flow, etc. So yeah, it's a very dynamic, a very, very changeable situation, and how we adapt to respond to the future landscape of the care and the result, where it's coming from, and how we can adapt it to meet that kind of needs. I think it is a challenge for all of us.
Can I just add to that really quickly, because we haven't yet finished putting our data together about the ARI feedback. Sorry, Sarah, we're still writing it up. But the GPs are saying, when you get data as rapidly as possible back that's meaningful to them and their patients, they're participatory, and I'm sure the communities will say the same. So point of care is great, but as close as possible that, why am I collecting the surveillance data? Why am I participating? Does it mean something for me and my community? If we can crack that, then I think that would be fantastic.
And if I can make one observation from being involved in surveillance for about 30 years, is that we're often driven by what we have rather than what we need. And I think it's often quite driven by the organism side. So we can get specimens, we can test the organism. It's amazing science. But we have to understand the human context and the environmental context. That's often much harder information to get. So I think we've sometimes not always had all three legs of the stool there together. We've just had often one leg, which we know a lot about. And I think getting more that contextual information about whānau and individuals and communities is so important. And then the environmental side is often missing. So I think that's a real gap from where I sit. So looking at the next question is the big one about how do we get to this nirvana, surveillance nirvana in the future. And I think what systems are absolutely indispensable, what extra systems do we need, what systems might need to be rationalised, because we're very good at adding systems over time, but perhaps even need to retire some of them. And obviously the SHIVERS platform, I think, is giving us some many gold standard elements, but even that can probably be improved. So again, perhaps starting from, this is more the provider side, which we fortunately have a number of experts on the panel. But again, starting with you, Nick, what do you think about how we get there? What are the systems you think we can't live without? What are systems that perhaps don't contribute so much? How can we rationalise it?
Yeah, I want to start probably... it's turned off now. Try the other one. That one? This is going. First, I think, at a high level, I think the issue around the need to rationalise, totally agree, the need to look at what's the optimum system, look what with the components we've got in place and what are the priorities for new systems. In the context of that, I think it's probably important to, everyone's aware that Public Health Agency has been working on a thing called the Public Health Laboratory Operating Model, which is getting to the point of where it will be ready for stakeholder engagement. And so that is, I can't go into more detail around it today, but it is looking at it from that perspective and looking at actually taking that bigger perspective, working with other stakeholders, obviously Te Aka Whaiora and National Public Health Service and Te Whatuora. So I think there is a broader piece of work from a government perspective looking at the whole system, and I think this would fit very neatly in within that. Then in terms of the specifics, you've mentioned which of the current systems making useful contribution. I think we've talked about that quite a lot already. What are the additional systems of the future? I think, I agree with you, Nikki, around the potential for AI and text-based search strings and so on, modern technology. And that applies not only within the health record, but I think it applies also within other domains, social media, for example. So there's a lot of opportunity there. Then how can the SHIVERS platform contribute? I think, we'll discuss that in more detail as the day goes on, but clearly there's a lot a lot of value in the existing platforms, and there may be ways that they can be refocused to address some of those specific issues. But I'll hand over.
I was just going to ask, Nick,
Yeah.
the potential to integrate with things like the IDI, which is a huge strength and knowledge or data strength in New Zealand, is that also within the remit of the central agencies of the government?
The IDI is, I don't, some of my colleagues from ISK might want to comment on this, but there are, obviously, it's seen as a very important tool for looking at the intersection between different sectors of government and different sections, and looking at the influences between other determinants on health outcome, for example. It has strengths and it has weaknesses. It doesn't very well deal with whānau as a concept because of the way it's set up, and I think, coming back to your point, Pōrā, that's, it's critical to us to understand the whānau context of all of this.
Yeah, I think it does have the ability to link in data with the wider context, doesn't, of people's lives, and also take more of a life course approach. So it's not just looking at a single acute episode. And much the impact of infectious disease is on altering your long-term trajectory in really important ways. I think we heard that from Kaz yesterday, Kaz Burns, about the impact of acute infections, which is just so important on long-term health.
Yeah.
But
one other thing just to mention is I think we need to be aware of what we're each doing, because I know, for example, that sometimes there's analysis being done by our group within the PHA and it's been replicated elsewhere, and we just don't have enough resource to be inefficient like that.
Yeah.
So I hand it to Pōrā now about this question of how do we get to this future that we hopefully all agree on?
So we're about being strong, prepared and unified. So that really reiterates what everybody said already about coming together. A lot of it comes down to, knowledge is power, right? A lot of it comes down to sharing power. And the knowledge that each of you have, that you've built up over by doing what you do is, that's, leadership is sharing. Leadership is building others. You can, whichever one you use, feed a man for a day, teach him to fish, you can pick a whole number of sayings in there. But I encourage and implore to exercise the leadership by sharing the knowledge. Many will say share your power, which I agree with. I'm not going to say that though. So I'll say share your knowledge and lift up the people that that we serve. I would say living a good quality life is meaningful for all Māori. Having the tools to make good decisions, informed decisions, and there's a wee bit around misinformation, disinformation, but that's part of tools, right? That's part of surveillance, is making sure the right information is out there, and who is the messenger. So everything is meaningful. We must move past the point where we say, well, you tell us how this feels for you, to a place where we go, what, this is for you to lead, not for you to feed the beast, and we carry on doing what we need to do, but we do this together. And I think that's a strong point out of Tenefa, is we're united in how we move forward, where there is strength in there because we have each together, there's things to learn on both sides, the capacity to understand each other, to come to an agreement, to hop in a boat together, whichever one you choose there. But we've gone through those motions because I love the way you describe the science and all the things that we need to do. That's the easy stuff, really. We've got to take the next step forward and rip the Band-Aid off and get on with the partnership. And you will truly, truly achieve greatness when we can bridge the partnership between the sciences and the community and the beautiful knowledge that we've accumulated. that's a very philosophical way, but it, yeah.
Ooh, what can I add? No, I don't think so. So clearly, in addition to the huge opportunities that we have now with the new agencies and the new ways of working and the ways of looking at how we organise surveillance and set those priorities, we've also got massive opportunities through the TNIFA platform to try some things out. What's new? What will work for communities? What are their priorities? How can we make a surveillance system that's more effective for Maori Pacific work within the broader system? Different layers of surveillance types, have different advantages and disadvantages, and serve different purposes. So, starting at the top, why are we doing any of this? Is it working? And where are those gaps and where do we fill them? And obviously that's what we're here today to discuss as part of that, but we've got a long way to go, and there are these amazing opportunities that are happening right now, which is great that we just can keep talking about it and connecting, because, as you say, Nick, people have brilliant ideas and they get on and they do things without communicating with each other and making sure that there's good, effective partnerships and that we're all doing it for a unified purpose. So that's thank you.
Nikki?
Yeah, hopefully not to be too repetitive with the great stuff you've all said, but I think obviously we've got to start from what is the question, what are we using surveillance for, is it fit for purpose? We obviously need a Ministry of Health national directive. The list that Nick started with is a great starting point. What do we want surveillance for? What are our questions? And then review those questions in the review, because they change over time. The world is unpredictable. So I think we've got to get the starting point wrong. Starting with what do we want to know? Is it fit for that? And what do we want to know now? And what do we think we want to know over time and over future, thinking about our longitudinal outcomes? So that's the starting point. And then the second separate question is our data collection mechanisms. Are they what we want? What can we prune down on and what can we add to? And we've started that conversation today. And so I would say, how many virological samples do we need in the country? How many do we need? How many do we want to keep going with? Where could we prune less? How much syndromic data do we need? Does it cover all our different communities? Are we accessing it enough? How many platforms do we need? Are they stable? Can we combine them? Where's our absent and limited data? Clearly our community narratives are very limited. How do we do them repeatable and over time? Are we using modern technology effectively enough? I think, we could really, with our research platforms, really try some cool, innovative stuff as we've been discussing. And also, we've just touched on the whole social media area. That's another way to really look at community narratives. We should be tapping in more and more to that as we've been doing. And then let's be flexible, let's review and let's keep talking about it, because it's, we're not going to make a decision today, it's going to change tomorrow and the next day. So recognising unpredictability and walking with that.
I think you all covered it very, very well. And I just want to add a few small points. That is, this, as Marc-Alain mentioned before, we have our unique setting. We are a little island, and we are overall quite collaborative. We know each other for many years and very comfortable to work with each other. And those are all very, very good starting point. And we are all very fortunate to have not just New Zealand government interest and TNIFA's interest, community interest. We also have international donors' interest and international, funders, government interest. So those actually pulled together can be really powerful resource for we to build a better surveillance in the future. And we do have a challenge because COVID will stay with us for a long time. Now, not going to disappear yet, and they have a different profile, different disease caused, different requirement for surveillance. All that kind of stuff actually requires to really, this probably is a time for us to re-evaluate using the same thinking we talked about of what is the aim, what do we want to achieve, what in our toolbox, what kind of new tool we need to add into it. I think it's a good time for this conversation to start, and with the new ways and the new talent in public health agency and the new blood into our community. And I think it will help us to bring us to the next phase, to face the pandemic or face severe seasonal endemic virus threat.
Thanks. So we've just got time for one very quick question from the panel, maybe not much time for the audience. The big question, I think, for me is how do we integrate all this? How do we make it happen? Because the need is greater, the system's capability has never been greater than it is now across a whole suite of genomics, of long-term health, the IDI and everything else. So, and also the number of agencies in Wellington who are all concerned about this has never been greater. And so how do we make it all work? Because I can already say in the last few months things have got less integrated in some key areas that I'm aware of. So how do we actually achieve an integrated outcome? We're a small country, we're very well resourced in this area now, world leaders in many ways. So how can we make it work? Has anyone got an answer for this?
Well,
no pressure.
it's not a complete answer, but I just think it's good for the audience to be aware that at the national agency level there is quite a lot of work going on to try and develop shared governance arrangements, shared decision-making processes, and we're now exploring this knowledge of the public health knowledge and surveillance system, which is it's intended to be agency neutral, provider neutral. It's about an integrated system, an integrated way of identifying what are the knowledge products, what are the surveillance products that we as a nation need, and then we work through the process of actually implementing that through multiple providers. And there's going to be a lot more discussion, I think, on how that happens. So I think that's the first point. I think we're very lucky in that we've got a government of the day that recognises the importance of public health surveillance, the importance of public health knowledge, and is making investments in it. We have to design for equity and design for community engagement. It has to be built in to the process right from the start. And I think, I know we've got all these opportunities for things like, using data lakes, etc., but I still think there's a lot to be said for looking explicitly at data standards and interoperability and actually building systems that can talk to each other right from the start.
So I think we've reached time, so we better finish there, but a huge thank you to our panel for their really great